To Bible class, I'll introduce our speaker this evening. I think most all of you know Andy Robison, but he is our speaker tonight. And in case you don't know, he's the director of the West Virginia School of Preaching and a great preacher also. His wife Marcia is with him this evening. They have two kids, Hannah and Andrew. And Hannah, where is she going to school now?
Well, she's out of school. She's in Dallas.
In Dallas, okay. I knew she'd finished up Harding here a couple years ago, and their son Andrew's at Harding, and of course that's certainly where our daughter goes to. And they don't know each other. It's a big enough campus probably that they don't run into each other. But anyway, Andy does a great job and has a brilliant memory, as you might remember from our gospel meeting, and he did that for us this last year. And I know with anything he has to say tonight will be a blessing to us all, an encouragement and a challenge. And so I don't want to take any more of his time, so I'm going to let Andy come up at this time.
Is this thing on? Can you hear me now? Yeah, I think it's on. All right. Good evening. We're very glad to be here tonight. I wondered how long it would be after we got in the door that someone brought up the time that we were late for the meeting. And it took about 30 seconds, I believe. So thank you, Randy King, very much. We are very glad to be here. We came Route 250 tonight. It was a beautiful drive. The roads from Cameron are newly paved, and they're doing well. I asked my wife if she wanted to move to Cameron. No. Littleton, no. But we're very glad to be here with you tonight. I want to thank you for your support of the school and your support of me particularly, your support of some of our students in the past. Thank you very much. Things are looking good at the school right now. There's always some obstacles that we have, but things are looking pretty good. We have 7 students that are returning for our second year class. We have 5 that are coming in for our first year class. We had 5 a while back. 2 of those dropped out for different reasons. Now we have 2 more. But that gives us 12 students, and if I'm counting right, that ties a record for the most students the school has ever had. So we're thankful for that, very thankful. A lot of people put in a lot of hard work. Our elders have done a lot of hard work in that. We also have Scott Judge, whom I believe you supported as a student, that's now working for us. He's got a couple weeks under his belt, and he's going to be our advertising and recruiting director. He's not an assistant director. He's not like an associate director in line for the directorship or something like that. I want to remind him he's not after my job. He's to focus on advertising and recruiting and doing a lot of travel for us, and he's going to be great at it, I believe. So we thank you very much for your support in those regards. Had a little joke to tell you from one of our students before we started. What's the difference between a hippo and a Zippo? Well, one's really heavy and the other one's a little lighter. Oh. You like that one, Dane? Yeah, okay, all right. Well, our subject tonight is the question, is there absolute truth? In John chapter 18, verse 36, Jesus said famously, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Now Pilate was the one questioning him. Pilate is worried about his status with the Roman government, and so he says to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus had said, "My kingdom." This is a reasonable follow-up question. So if you have a kingdom, are you a king? Jesus answers. A lot of times he did not answer at his trial. He was as silent as a lamb led to the slaughter when the false accusations were flying. But when someone asked something that was a truth, he said an answer to it. Here he said, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born into the world, and for this cause I've come into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth." Now there's a curveball, isn't there? Are you a king? What's that got to do with truth? I'm not sure I know. But Jesus throws him a curveball because he was a master teacher, and he could do that to get people thinking. So he gets Pilate thinking, I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth, and then he says this, which would be arrogant if it were anybody else and if it weren't true. He says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate cynically responds to him with these 3 words. What is truth? What is truth? Now on the way in, I think it was Mark said to me, You got the easiest topic all this summer series because everybody believes there's truth. Well, I'd like to think that, and I think he might have been joking with me. But our world today is called postmodern world. Postmodernism has a lot of different facets to it, but one of the main facets of it is there is no such thing as truth. You're just as right as I am. That religion is just as right as this religion. There are constructs. There are meta-narratives. That is some big story that people made up to try to keep people in line. Christianity is the big story in the West. Islam is the big story in the East. And if we could just break down all religion and tell people nobody's right, then we'd have a better world. That's the idea of postmodernism. There's no such thing as truth. Christianity's not true. Islam's not true. But if you're going to abide by each other, you think your way's true and you think your way's true, and everybody just get along with it. That's the idea in our world today. That's what flows down from the ivory towers. There are different theories of truth. There are different ideas behind truth. Matter of fact, a few years ago, in 2009 I think it was, when I held a meeting here, I opened my series of meetings with the lesson on, is there truth in religion? Well, some of this might overlap, but mostly this is a completely different lesson. There's just so much to cover on this idea. What I'm going to do is back up beyond what you believe, beyond what you good Bible students know, to what we were talking about if we were talking to people in the world that need to understand that there is such a thing as truth just to get started. You remember, I think I've mentioned it to you before, I mentioned it in my school report wherever I go, that our world today is different from the world of the 1950s. Most people in the 1950s believed there was a God, believed the Bible was His Word, and you just had to argue about what was in the Bible. But now a lot of people don't believe the Bible is God's Word. A lot of people don't believe that there is a God. What do you do with that? Well, you have a different starting point. Paul in Athens, Greece, started at a different point than he did in a synagogue in Antioch and Pisidia. In Athens, Greece, he said, the God that made you is the one I'm talking about. This unknown God statue they have, let me tell you about Him. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He made the heaven and the earth. But in Antioch and Pisidia, he starts with the Old Testament Scriptures. In our world today, sometimes you have to use philosophy to get to the very point that you can talk to people about the Bible, and you have to go a long way to even get there. Well, that's kind of the crux of this lesson. I'm indebted to Dick Stanyo in his book, Graceful Reason, for a lot of the material of this lesson. I want to give credit where credit is due. Any errors, though, please blame me. Our society needs to have an awareness that there are moral issues. There is such a thing as a moral issue. Do you know that there are people that deny that? There are people that believe in determinism. That is, you evolved, you really don't have any choice. I was reading one of them just the other day. There are still these people around, and they still teach, and they still have disciples, that they just believe in determinism, that you think you're making choices, but you're really not making choices. You're just evolved, and this non-living matter in you is just firing the synapses in your brain, and you just make those choices, but you don't really make the choices. It's just evolution. It's just science happening. There are no moral issues, they say. Now, if that's the case, I don't know why they would trust their own brain. If this is just a bunch of accidental firings of synapses in their brain, why would they trust their thoughts about there being no... You see what they're doing? They're reasoning that there's no reasoning, and they're reasoning that their brains can't reason, but they're trusting their brains when they say their brains can't reason. None of this makes any sense. But this is what a lot of people believe. There is an awareness of moral issues within man. This is basic knowledge to Bible believers. That is, you have a body, you have a soul. That's called dualism in the philosophy world. There is an idea that there is truth and that behavior ought to be based on that truth. Most of us believe that. But I have a friend who recently did a campaign over in Maryland, an evangelistic campaign. 2 people showed up at it. They were in their 70s, and they'd never heard of such a thing as a soul. Didn't know a soul existed. Didn't know there was anything more than body. That's an older generation. Can you imagine what a younger generation in this world believes? Well, just look how they act. You can tell what they believe. Warnings, you see, come true. Throughout the Old Testament prophets, God would say, if you people don't listen to my word, I'll take it away from you. One place was Amos chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. God said, behold, the days are coming when I will cause a famine in the land, not a famine for bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. Many shall wander from sea to sea and from north to east. They shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. Why would God do such a thing? Because they didn't listen to it when they had it, so it would disappear from their society. That's exactly what happens in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. God predicts there will be a time that He would allow people to believe a lie. God will send them a strong delusion so that they will believe the lie, who did not love the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Well, you can see, looking around, that our society is losing a grasp of Scripture very quickly, and even a grasp that there is such a thing as a soul very quickly. We need to be aware that there are moral issues. I would appeal to people's common sense and say, unseen entities exist. The evolutionist has a problem with this. The evolutionist would say, all that you can see is all that exists. It has to be in a test tube for it to be real. You have to be able to do science on it for it to be real. It has to be seen, it has to be visible to be in existence. But think with me, please. Can you put love in a test tube? Is love real? Can you put joy, peace in a test tube? Are those things real? Unseen entities exist. Can you put thinking in a test tube? You could put your brain in a test tube. You can put mine in a really small test tube. You can put your brain in a test tube, but you can't put thinking. You can't put guilt. You can't put remorse. You can't put the joy of penitence in a test tube, but these things really exist. Now, where did they come from? If you believe in evolution, then you believe that those things just came and evolved out of nothing, and they are just happenstance firings of synapses in your brain, and why should you trust them? But nothing comes from nothing. Science will tell you that. They try to back up far enough for you, but nothing comes from nothing. Then these things that aren't evolving matter, according to the scientist's definition, or the evolutionary scientist's definition, these things that aren't coming from matter, you don't take a pile of bricks and get love, you don't take a pile of mortar and assemble guilt, they aren't coming from physical matter. From where do they come? They're spiritual things. They're of the Spirit, so they must come from a spirit. Where does information in your genes come from? Where does information in your cells come from? Where does the idea of the unseen things come from? Well, most reasonable thing is to say someone put them there. The most reasonable thing to say about this physical universe is that it bears so much design that a designer had to put it there. And that's another whole discussion, but the most reasonable thing to say about these unseen things is that an unseen spirit, a person, put them there. You see, the intelligent design argument says that where there's a cause, where there's an effect, there had to be a cause. Where there's design, there had to be a designer. That explains the world physically, but what about these unseen entities? Well, you need some sort of unseen thing for them. What about these personal ideas of love and joy that you share with each other? They needed to come from person. And that person, of course, is God. God is a spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. Is there such a thing as absolute morality? That is, we're going a step beyond truth, because truth implies behavior. Is there such a thing as behaving in a moral way? And it's absolute, it's everywhere. There are some things that are always right, and there are some things that are always wrong. Is there such a concept as that? A lot of people in our ivory towers, in our colleges, in our secular universities, in our high schools, in our middle schools, and in our grade schools say no, there is not. Do good and evil exist? When they're pressed, they'll be backed into a corner and they'll come up with some sort of silly answer, but they purport that there is no such thing as good and evil. But I would suggest to you that there is such a thing as good and evil, and that they would have to admit it at some point. You believe there's good and evil. To what can we attribute such ideas? Did good evolve from matter? Did evil evolve from matter? Or did these things come from spirit, mind, and personality? You see what we're doing, folks? Bible believers? We're making a case for the existence of God from the existence of morals. We're kind of arguing both ways here, as I'll try to show you as we move along. There are two choices for what you believe about right and wrong. Big words here. One of them is ethical relativism. Ethical relativism says that there's no such thing as right or wrong. What you believe is just as good as what I believe, even if they're completely opposite. Why, who am I to judge you? That's how it comes across. Don't judge me. Don't be a judge. Judge not, that you be not judged. We discussed that in the Sermon on the Mount a while back. That's the idea of ethical relativism. That is, that ethics originate within either the self or within a society. My ethics, my behavior, they either come from me or they come from my government. That's the idea of ethical relativism. And if my government says one thing is right and good, and the government of China says a different thing is right and good, then who am I to say my way is better than the Chinese way? And who are they to say that their way is better than mine? That's ethical relativism right there. The second choice is ethical absolutism. Ethical absolutism says there is the origin of good versus evil in a supernatural personality that transcends every person, transcends self, and transcends and is above society, so that all societies are amenable to it. Remember what Paul said in Athens? These times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he judged the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained, and he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. You see what he said? These times of ignorance, this idolatry, God has winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. God is claiming, Paul is claiming for God, that unseen God, that he has the moral code for everybody to follow. That's the idea of ethical absolutism. Atheism breeds relativism. And I would argue backwards that people want relativism, so they try to do away with God. Because without God, you can have relativism. Everybody's ideas can be just what they want them to be. So they argue against God for that reason. Jean-Paul Sartre, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was a French atheistic existentialist studying reality who rejected morality as meaningless. He said, "The existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven." If there's no God, there are no values. There's no good, there's no evil if there's no God. It's been stated in other ways. Dostoevsky, the Russian author of the Brothers Karamazov, had one of his characters say, "There is no virtue if there is no immortality." That is, if there's no afterlife in which we have to answer, then people aren't going to behave here. Why should they? Let them do what they want if they don't have to answer for it in judgment. Others, like Dave Everson, have said to me, without God, nothing matters. With God, nothing else matters. The Apostle Paul illustrated this idea in 1 Corinthians 15 when he's talking about the resurrection, how he says Christianity is meaningless without the resurrection. In verse 32, one of his arguments is this: if the dead do not rise, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Let's just party if the dead don't rise. If there's no God, there's no judgment, there's no virtue, there's no morality, there's no reason to do anything right. You just do whatever you want to do, and if somebody gets in your way, kick them. You'll never have to answer for it, as long as you can get away with it here on earth. And if your government says you can get away with it here on earth, all the better. Just like our government says you can kill your baby in your womb if you like. That's truth to them. And if you can get away with that, there's no answering for it. That leaves a problem for the atheist, because the atheist would still denounce a fellow like Hitler, but if their idea that there's no God is true, then Hitler got off scot-free with everything he did. He lived 45, 50 years, I forget exactly how much, committed suicide, and was done, and went to nothing, and he never got punished for it. If there's no God, and if there's no judgment. I don't think they want that consequence. However, this is, I'm convinced, the main reason for atheism. Without God, everything would be permitted. There's permissiveness. Now, I'm for multiculturalism in that we don't discriminate against any race, we don't discriminate against any nationality. But if you want to tell me that Islam is just as good as Christianity, we have a problem. If you want to tell me that Buddhism is just as good as Christianity, we have a problem. The leaders of Islam and Buddha did not rise from the dead on the third day. And they did not ascend to heaven, and they were not prophesied, and they were not witnesses of the resurrection. There was for Christ. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. But people want to get rid of God so that they can have permissiveness. I don't have this quote in here, but Aldous Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. Charles Darwin that came up with the theory of evolution, or at least codified it in the 1800s, and Thomas Huxley kind of pushed it on society. His grandson Aldous Huxley was the author of the Brave New World novel that you've read about, or maybe even read. Aldous Huxley said something like this: We were awfully glad that evolution came along because we were glad to get rid of God. Because God interfered with our sexual pleasure. We could do whatever we want without God. So we're glad evolution was there. That's why people don't want there to be a truth, because they don't want to behave according to truth. Ethical relativism, Stanyo points out in his book, has several problems. I just want you to think with me a little bit, please. I know there's not a lot of Bible here yet. You see what I'm doing. There won't be a lot of Bible here. I'm arguing as if we're talking to people who don't even believe there's such a thing as truth. Pretend you don't believe there's truth for a minute. Pretend that you believe all ethics are relative and there's not anyone better than another, and see if you see any problems with it. Problem number one, is it true that there is no such thing as truth? You think that one through for a little bit. If somebody says to you, there's no such thing as truth, you ask them, is that true? And if they say yes, then they've just defeated themselves. And you get into the utmost silliness. I'm sorry to be crude. I wouldn't be this crude with someone who was talking to me openly about it and trying to really search for it. But you get into the silliest things. Is it true that there's no such thing as truth? Well, yes. Then it is a truth that there's no truth. It is a truth that there's no truth. How does that work? That can't work. Ethical relativism has some other problems. It has nothing positive to offer. It's great at criticizing, but it's not so great at actually doing anything. It's great at poking holes at absolutism, just like some people are great at poking at people who are in power and in office, but when they get in office, they find out they have the same problems. Oh, people, we're going to get out of war. We're going to remove all these troops. And then at the end of their term, what are they doing? They're leaving the troops right where they started. You see what I'm saying? People criticize. I told somebody after I became director of the school, somebody called and said, how you like being director? I said, not so fun. I think I'll quit and go back to criticizing for a little bit. You know, it's easier to criticize. Well, that's what ethical relativism does. It just criticizes absolutism. Once it's in power, how does it work? Oh, we won't have time to discuss all that. This is from Stanyo's book, Graceful Reason. Problem number one, ethical relativism delegitimizes truth. Ethical relativism says cultures have different moral standards, so all of those different moral standards must be right. If this culture wants to commit cannibalism, that's right to them. If this culture wants to commit abortion, that's right to them. If this culture doesn't, that's right to them. Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of our Supreme Court justices. Here was one of his quotes. He says, truth is the majority vote of that nation that could lick all others. That is, if you got a nation with the strongest military and it can beat everybody, and 51% of the people agree that there's a truth there, then that's truth. Kind of cynical. He also said that law is what legislatures guess at to see if the judges will uphold it. You see that coming true in our society now? I said a while back, real cynically, before a legislature bothers to pass a law, why don't they just go to the Supreme Court and ask if it's going to be okay with them? Because that's how it's going to go. He knew it several years ago. And that's the way our law students have been trained, and that's the kind of judges that we have in power now. Another person said, truth is what my colleagues will let me get away with. My dad taught me that law is only law if people respect it, and I believe there are a lot of people running our country at some time that believe that law is whatever they can get away with. A lot of people buy into this philosophy. A lecturer was challenged one time. Somebody came up to him and said, truth is just a human construct. That is, humans made it up. It's just a human construct. You know what he said to him? He said, is it true that before there were any humans on earth, let's see, how do you say that? Before there were any humans on earth, is it true that there were no humans on earth? If it was true that there were no humans on earth before there were humans on earth, then truth can't be a human construct. And they'd have to admit to that. Brilliant line of reasoning. Problem number one with ethical relativism is it delegitimizes the idea of truth. Problem number two, let it happen to you. One fellow may say, in that culture, adultery and rape are just fine because that's how they were raised, that's how they believe. Women don't mind it that much. They don't mind. But let it happen to his wife. Let somebody commit adultery with his wife, rape her, cannibalize her, and see if he then feels like it's still an equal moral decision. Those guys that flew planes into the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon and in the ground on September 11, 2001, thought they were doing morally right. They believed they would go immediately to paradise for doing so. They believed their truth. Is that equal to our truth? What if we flew their planes into their buildings? How would they feel about that ethical relativism now? That's the second problem with ethical relativism. Problem 3 is time. A person could say one thing in 1980 and a different thing in 2010, and they could both be right. Now listen, folks, you have that happening in politics today. In the 1990s, one politician signed the Defense of Marriage Act, that marriage would only be between a man and a woman. That politician's significant other now marches in gay pride parades. When were they right? When were they right? This is how we get where we are when we have this philosophy to begin with. I'm sorry if I'm getting too political, but this is where we are. The consensus theory of truth says exactly that. If we can get a consensus on something, that's what truth is. One of these candidates that's running now for an office in our land said in the 1990s about something, we ought to be able to come to a consensus that this is a moral obligation. I won't tell you what the person was talking about, and I won't tell you who it is, but I'll tell you this. It doesn't matter if people agree that it's a moral obligation or not. It either is or it isn't a moral obligation. It doesn't matter. But that displays, that projects, that is telling about what they think behind the scenes. The pragmatic theory of truth is the end justifies the means. That is, do whatever you got to do to get your way, and the end justifies the means. Have you ever seen that working out in politics anywhere in the world? Time. You can say one thing at one point, another thing at another point. They both be right if truth is relative. Problem number 4 about relative truth. How could anybody ever say that one behavior is better than another? Could you say that generosity is better than stinginess? No, you can't say that, because if there's no absolute morals, if there's no absolute truth, then stinginess is a quality just equal to generosity. How could you ever say that being courageous in battle is better than hoofing it out of there and running from your buddies? You couldn't say that if truth is relative. Do you see how to reason with people? If there's no moral standard, how do you say so? Problem number 5. If morality is relative to cultures and places, then people who try to reform a practice are always immoral. And that makes them immoral, and that says that there's an absolute morality. But that's another problem. If Martin Luther came along and said that selling the forgiveness of sins was wrong, then he was immoral, because to those people at that time in the Catholic Church, that was right. If slavery, if moral absolutes are not absolute, if there are just different standards in different cultures, then Martin Luther King Jr. was wrong to lead the civil rights movement, because it was right in the American South to oppress black people. Lincoln was wrong to try to free the slaves, because slavery was right, because that was the culture of the time, if ethical relativism is true. I hope nobody takes any of these quotes out of context. See where I'm putting them in context. If it's true that there's no truth, then why would anybody want to reform any practice that they find objectionable? How could they argue for civil rights? Problem number 6 is closely related. There are consequences if there is ethical relativism. What about galley slaves? Was that ethical, to have men in the galleys rowing the ships and beating them all day and feeding them barely enough and then just throwing them out when they die and hoping they die when they get old so you don't have to take care of them? What about slavery? What about cannibalism? What about jihad? Are these things just as right as other things? The person who says there's no absolute truth hopefully would be backed into a corner by this question and hopefully would admit it. Problem number 7, there's contradiction. No two people could ever contradict each other on a moral statement. I could say murder is wrong. Marcia could say murder is right, and you'd have to all say, well, you're both right. If there's no ethical absolutes, and if there is no such thing as truth. Problem number 8, legislating morality. I've heard a lot of people say this, including people who were very dear to me. Well, you can't legislate morality. Back when we tried to get people to vote against people who were doing cruel things like aborting babies, they'd say, oh, you can't legislate morality. That's an intimidation tactic. Really? You can't legislate morality? That terminates in absolutism. You could say it's always wrong to legislate morality. Well, then you got a moral absolute. But think about it. If it's wrong to legislate morality, we'd still have galley slaves, we'd still have slavery, we'd still have polygamy. We'd still have child marriages, we could still have infant sacrifices. If it's wrong to legislate morality, let's take all the laws against rape off the books. If it's wrong to legislate morality, let's take all the laws against incest off the books. If it's wrong to legislate morality, let's take all the laws against murder off the books. We've already done that for a large portion of our society. If there's no such thing as truth, that's the logical end. Jeffrey Dahmer got addicted to pornography, believed in evolution, became a rapist and a cannibal, and then was finally sentenced to prison and beat up and killed in prison. After he was in prison, he was converted and baptized into Christ. And he gave a few interviews. He said this, among other things: if you don't think that there is a God to be accountable to, and no atheistic evolutionist does, what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. When we died, that was it. There was nothing. That's what Hitler believed, was evolution. And that's why he did what he did. He believed he was right to exterminate what he deemed to be inferior races. If evolution is true, why not behave any way that you want to behave? Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of atheists who are really good, decent people. Can you be an atheist and be a good, decent person? Yes. Can you be an atheist and have a reason to be a good and decent person? No. You're probably just inheriting some Christian principles. You're probably just going along to get along. But a lot of atheists run the gamut with these sorts of things, and they don't, and some of them actually follow the consequences of their logic, like Jeffrey Dahmer did. Now, I'm arguing two directions here. One is this: if there is no God, then there's no such thing as truth. And if there's no such thing as truth, then there's no restraint. If I can get away with it, I should do it. I told you this joke 7 years ago, but I'll tell it to you again. About a guy that pulls up behind somebody in a car. The guy has a bumper sticker that says, "If it feels good, do it." So he rammed him. Guy got out of his car shaking his fist. Why'd you do that? It felt good. See, that's the problem with this. There's no restraint. And as join it to the other, that's problem number 2 that we had. If there's no God, there's no such thing as truth, then there's no restraint. But now argue the other way. If there is such a thing as wrong, a lot of people that claim to be atheists can be backed into a corner this way. Is there such a thing as wrong? Well, no, there's no such thing as good and evil. One student tried to back one of my friends and a philosopher back into a corner this way. She was arguing, there's no such thing as truth. There's no moral right and wrong. She kept arguing, he kept arguing back, and finally he said to her, "Can I treat you any way I want?" She said, "No, you can't treat me any way you want." So you agree there's a wrong. You agree there's an absolute there. She had to agree. If there's a wrong, then there has to be a right. If there's something that's crooked, then you know that there's something that's straight. If you know that this behavior is wrong, you know that another behavior is right. If there's such a thing as right, where'd that come from? It didn't come from self. All individuals have different ideas. It didn't come from different societies. All societies have different ideas. Japan thought that they had descended from the gods, and their emperor was a god, and that's why they attacked Pearl Harbor and got themselves into World War II. Was that right? If there is a right, then there is a God that transcends all of us and has given the moral absolutes. That's known as the moral argument for God. Absolutism, you see, must be true. Ethical relativism simply doesn't work. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 28 tells of a time in Jeremiah's history when the people had said, there's no truth. Truth has perished and fallen from the land. You know what the consequences of that were? The people were worshiping idols in the temple, and the people were offering infant sacrifices to the god Molech in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31. Where there's no such thing as truth, eventually it devolves into a very bad moral situation. I don't have time to go through it. I wish I did. Judges 17 through 21, a fascinating reading. It is vulgar, it is violent, it is horrific in what happens. And do you know why it is all those things? 2 verses are repeated in that as the theme of that section. Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's why you had the perverted men of the city knocking on the door of the man saying, "Bring us out those men that came to you. We want to abuse them tonight." And the man thinks that he does the right thing by saying, "Here, take my concubine and abuse her all night." And he goes in and eats and drinks while they abuse her, rape her all night, kill her, and in the morning she's got her fingers clawing at the door threshold. He walks out the door and nobly says, "Come on, let's get up and go." I mean, it's bizarre. There is so much wrong. There's no good character and no bad character in these things. I mean, I should say, there's no good character in these things. Everybody's evil to some degree. And that's what happens when you expel truth from a society. Read that and meditate on it sometime. The Nazis were tried at the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Those Nazis who lived, those Nazis who were involved in the killing at the concentration camps. Their defense ran something like this. Number 1, our society had its needs and desires. Number 2, our society made its laws based on these needs and desires. Number 3, our society commanded us to exterminate Jews. Number 4, it would have been wrong for us not to obey our society. And number 5, you're wrong to try to judge us by the law of a different society. We were just doing what German law said to do. And since there's no right or wrong, you see, we've been here before, folks. We're just recycling old ideas. There's nothing new under the sun. They tried it in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It led to Nazi Germany and World War II. And now we're trying it again in America. But here's how that trial came out. Judge Robert Jackson from Jamestown, New York, said, "You're not being judged by American law, British law, or Russian law, but you're being judged by a higher law that rises above the provincial and the transient." I tell you what, you can find very few judges in the United States of America today who would agree that there's a higher and transient law, higher than transient law. They believe that truth is relative and you can make up your truth and judges write the law as they go along. They state that sort of thing. But Robert Jackson, back in the days when people had some morals, said, "No, we're not judging you by American, British, German law. We're judging you by God's law. It's wrong to do these things. There is such a thing as truth. There are moral absolutes." And when you get done to that, you get down to the Bible. The Bible has a lot to say about truth. Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness. Your law is truth. Psalm 119, verse 42. You are near, O Lord. All your commandments are truth. Psalm 119, verse 151. The entirety of your word is truth. Every one of your righteous judgments endures forever. Psalm 119, verse 160. John 14, verse 6, Jesus claimed, "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." In John 18:37, he said, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." In John 17:17, he spoke to God in his prayer. He said, "Sanctify them through your word. Your word is truth." He said that we will be judged by his word. Anyone who rejects my word and does not receive it has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. We will be judged, not by American law, and not by British law, not by Grecian law, not by Roman law, but by the law of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in the last day. He has the absolute morals, right and wrong. Why don't people want to believe this? Same thing that the ancient Greeks did, that the ancient Romans did, that the ancient Gentiles did. For the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. We don't want you to hear the truth. We're going to bury the truth. We're going to put the truth away. They don't tell you that openly, but I'll tell you what I do sometimes. I go to different news channels on the internet, different news. I can't stomach to watch news anymore. I can only take it in 30-second gaps. So I go to different channels. I go to one channel, one area, one station, one view, and then I go to another that's, I know, an opposing view, and it's like I'm in a whole different world. These people are telling me one thing's going on. These people are telling me a different thing's going on. There's nothing that reads like objective journalism anymore. Everybody's got their own particular truth. That's our society, and that's why we need to realize that there is such a thing as truth and pray that people will stop suppressing it for their own pleasures. I thank you for your attention. I think the bell's going to ring now.